This is the Middle-earth philosopher. During the latter half of the First Age, there are a few places that were considered safe or a refuge from evil after the Battle of Unnumbered Tears, from the ravages of a victorious Morgoth, who had just defeated the Noldor and their allies in the north of Beleriand, crushing their alliance. So, of those few places of refuge that remained, arguably the safest was the realm of Doriath, formed and led by High King Thingol and Queen Melian. It was a bastion for the Sindar Elves who sought to escape the wars between the Noldor, the North, and Morgoth. But Doriath was more than just that. It was a dream made reality thanks to the protection of Queen Melian and the leadership of King Thingol. The dream of the Sindar, of a time where they were not troubled by the wars of outside powers and things beyond their control, and a dream that was ultimately ill-fated. Now, the reason, as everybody knows, that Doriath was considered a safe haven, and again, arguably the safest haven in Middle-earth at that time for Morgoth, was because of the Girdle of Melian, a mysterious and unseen barrier that fenced the realm from all outside forces that were deemed to be hostile by King Thingol and his people. I'm honestly not quite sure how the mechanics work of it, but the only ones who could basically enter were basically Sindar, and then later on, humans who were seeking out refuge from the defeated North. Doriath itself had a long history that stretched back to nearly to the beginning of the First Age, before the rising of the sun and the moon, when this Teleri, who had chosen to stay in Middle-earth for various reasons from the Great Migration, inhabited Beleriand and were thus renamed the Sindar. And before all the troubles of the latter part of the First Age began, it was more or less kind of a midnight paradise for the elves who lived in that realm during that time. A realm where the Sindar could seek out wisdom and protection from its leaders, as well as trade and interact with dwarves, who, though they didn't entirely get along with, could basically interact and trade with them in a relatively peaceful manner. Essentially, that Doriath was to the Sindar what Valinor was to the Noldor, a tranquil paradise where any thoughts of conflict were completely foreign and alien. And again, that was until Morgoth arrived and started making war on the people of Beleriand in order to acknowledge him as their overlord. This was the First War of Beleriand, where Thingol formed an alliance with the Dwarves and the Elves of the Falas and the Green Elves to resist the invaders. The war produces mixed results, with the Sindar being able to repulse their invaders, but the Green Elves suffering such heavy losses, which included the king and his relatives, that they forsook any kind of conflict whatsoever after that. And with the Elves of the Falas being hemmed in on the coast, having lost their battlefield advantage. And it's then that the girdle is then created and continued to remain even after the enemy had been cleared out of Doriath and its surrounding lands by the arrival of the Noldor. So, in relation to the dream aspect that I mentioned before, the dream was more or less a reality throughout all of Beleriand before the war started, and then became a dream, or I should say better, an idea that after the war had started, because outside of the realm of Doriath, it was essentially chaos, and even after the First War, these areas were controlled more or less or given to the Noldor elves, who were pretty much foreigners and aliens as far as many of the Sindar were concerned. As the centuries drew on and the conflict started to grow steadily worse, this realm took on a more symbolic status, that of being a place free of war and conflict, whether it was from Morgoth or from the Noldor themselves. I believe for the Sindar that Doriath represented the preservation of the way things were, of what they used to be. To Sindar eyes, the powers of the ruling Kreen were strong enough to repel any invaders without them really having to lift a finger. And though there were still patrols and skirmishes along the borders, again, I'm not really familiar with how the Girdle of Melian actually works, nothing along the scale of what the Noldor endured ever occurred in Doriath while Thingol and Melian reigned. It's Thingol's cousin, Eol, who best expresses this view, that the Sindar lived in peace, and untroubled in their mighty trees and free of sunlight before the Noldor arrived, at least according to his perception. And of course, as everybody knows, Eowl's perceptions were not entirely correct, yet it is also fair to say that more than a few Sindar actually shared that sentiment. And yes, the Noldor did remove the orcs from southern Doriath and fenced Morgoth in the north for a while, but it was really Melian who had saved the Sindar with her powers. Moreover, the sun appeared when the Noldor arrived in Beleriand, a coincidence that did not go unnoticed by the Sindar, who valued starlight above almost anything else. While the first appearance of the sun and moon was not an apocalypse for the Sindar, it was recognized as the end of an era for them, at least an era that was worldwide, rather than limited to a small piece of land, more or less. The end of an everlasting peace under an equally everlasting light, starlight, replaced now by uncertainty and death and destruction outside of its borders, with allies that were quarrelsome, and in some cases, the Sindar were not sure that they would turn on them themselves, because it was no secret that many of the Noldor, though not all, held a prejudice towards any elves who were not from Valinor. Again, why they refer to them as Morquindi or Dark Elves, and thus were seen as uneducated, barely civilized, and relatively weak in all things when compared to them. And within the girdle of Melian, where that was the only comfort they could find in a dark and confused world, the Sindar held on to the dream of Doriath, that maybe one day things would go back to the way that they were. And when this was proved impossible, that at least within Doriath itself, the Sindar would be able to gain some semblance of the life they once had, and their old glory in their now shrunken realm. And I think this is ironic in a sense that it's most clearly seen in the final years of the First Age, when Dior, the grandson of a now deceased Thingol and Melian, who had taken up and left back to Valinor, takes up the crown of the High King of Doriath and tries to reestablish that realm and that reality as well. Because by this time, again, Thingol was long dead, and Melian had departed in grief because her husband was murdered, and this left the land of Doriath now unprotected and vulnerable to the attack and the dark forces that for so long it had held at bay. This reality came crashing down on them when deceived Dors of Novgorod sacked the cavern capital of Menegroth for the first time since its inception way back at the beginning of the First Age. For many of the Sindar, this, and not the Battle of Unnumbered Tears that had occurred decades earlier, had been their apocalypse. And now, Dior sought to perform a resurrection. However, the engine of the original dream of Doriath had been Melian herself and her divine nature as a Maiar, rivaling even Morgoth's powers, as he could not defeat it despite being the self-proclaimed strongest being in Middle-earth. And yes, I do think that's a fair point, since given Morgoth's past, he used to just overwhelm everybody and everything that stood against him, and with Melian, for whatever reason, he was just not able to do that. So that's why I make that statement. Regardless, Dior did have an engine of sorts for this dream, similar to what Melian had. That is, one of the remaining Silmarils that his father, Beren, and his mother Luthien had stolen and retrieved from Morgoth, who himself had stolen it from Fëanor, its original creator. Now, in this, and ironically, Dior actually had more power and more strength than his grandmother did, in that, again, as everyone knows, the Silmarils contained the light of the original trees of Valinor, which in and of themselves was made by the might of the Valar, that outranked Melian in terms of power and authority. So it was not without reason nor power that Dior sought to resurrect his grandparents' kingdom and their dream. And yet, he also failed to recognize the curse that came along with that divine power of the jewel, the oath sworn upon it by its original creator and his sons long before Dior himself was ever born. And, for whatever reason, Dior was caught unprepared for the second and final apocalypse upon the Sindar via the now haggard and desperate Noldor that remained to the sons of Fëanor. Though the jewel escaped along with one of his children, with other Sindar survivors, The attack was the final nail in the coffin for the Sindar dream of returning to the nights of peace and tranquility long before. The dream of Doriath held off the reality that with Morgoth's return, that Middle-earth was now irrevocably changed, and that there would be no returning. It was a perpetual state of denial that its rulers and people lived in and existed in. It was a snow globe, basically. Within this snow globe, they were content, in large part, to let the rest of Beleriand burn, until fate, or at least time, kicked down those doors and brought the New World Order crashing down upon them literally, until there was nothing left except legend, story, and song, and a solitary jewel that now soared across the sky. Having said all that, if you have any opinions or differing thoughts on this, please feel free to leave a comment below. But otherwise, this is the Middle-earth Philosopher, and have a good day.